A day's battle would make short work of these impudent and enterprising savages. Or at least that was according to Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton, a man who, frankly, should have known better. After all, the officer first donned a uniform 18 years prior when he received his commission, a duty that saw him face off against the Cheyenne on the Kansas frontier. And then came the Civil War, Bull Run, Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. Wheaton was there for all of them and commended for his actions. So one would assume that the lieutenant colonel was far too experienced to underestimate his opponents. That he should have known that a well-dug-in, desperate man with a rifle and a will to fight, especially when fighting for his family, could put up one hell of a mighty defense. But I wasn't there, and I'm not going to play armchair general on this one. All I know is that when the smoke cleared on that January morning in 1873, at least 35 soldiers lay dead with nearly as many wounded. And the Modoc Nation had shown just how impudent and enterprising they could be. That it would take much more than a day's worth of battle to rein in these determined fighters. Turns out this conflict would last quite a while. And when you take into account the number of people killed coupled with the dollars expended per enemy, this lesser known of the so-called Indian Wars would be one of the most expensive ever fought on U.S. soil. One which pitted just 50 to 60 Modoc warriors against nearly 1,000 U.S. troops and volunteers. Who was Captain Jack? Who were the Modoc? And what caused the Modoc War? Go ahead and get your peace pipe out for this one. You're probably gonna need it. My name's Josh, and you're listening to the Wild West Extravaganza. Captain Jack was born into the Modoc people sometime around the year 1837, near Tule Lake in present-day Northern California. And this was the land the Modoc had called home for God only knows how long, at least a millennium, if not more. Just to give you an idea of how far back the Modoc go in this region, there are oral stories passed down among them and their relatives turned enemies to Klamath, describing what we think was the Mount Mazama volcano eruption nearly 8,000 years ago. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that Modoc roots run deep in that roughly 5,000 square mile region on the Oregon-California border. Land sandwiched between the lower Cascades to the west and the Warner Range to the east, providing the Modoc all they needed to flourish. An abundant supply of fish and wild game, roots, acorns, water lily seeds especially, were a big staple ingredient for the Modoc that they would grind into a flour or meal. And the tule reeds that grew along the lakes and marshes provided the Modoc with their shelter, living in teepee-like lodges covered in mats made from the hollowed straws. At least they did when it was warmer out. During the winters, they'd reside in pit houses, dugout-type shelter usually about 15 or so feet deep, lined with grass and dirt for insulation, with a ladder up top. Never a very large tribe, most estimates place the Modoc population at around 400 to 500 souls at about the time of European contact, which for them was just a few short years before old Captain Jack was born. By the way, his real name wasn't actually Captain Jack. The Modoc leader's given handle was Kintpuash, meaning he who strikes the water brashly. But for the sake of your ears and my mouth, I will stick with Captain Jack. And I do so out of respect. I'm relatively certain I'm not pronouncing Kintpuash correctly, so I'd rather call the man Jack than constantly butcher his real name. Now, as I alluded to a decade prior or so to Jack's birth, British-Canadian fur trader Peter Ogden began doing business with the Klamath, a rival tribe directly north of the Modoc. More trappers and traders would follow, encroaching both on Klamath and Modoc territory. And things were okay at first. The natives of the southern Oregon, northern California region obtained firearms and horses from the early trappers and traders, in addition to other highly coveted items, the same sort of trade goods I mentioned in my last episode. Mirrors, metal trinkets, pots, kettles, knives, hatchets, all that good stuff. But you know the old saying, throughout the course of history, when two foreign peoples initially encounter each other, first they fornicate and then they fight. Now, I don't know how much of the former occurred, but as to the latter, there were skirmishes as early as 1834, when a Hudson's Bay fur trapping expedition led by Miquel Lafamboise was said to have killed 11 Rogue River natives. Now, these were not Modoc. The Rogue River peoples were a conglomeration of tribes living along the Rogue River Valley in present-day southwestern Oregon, kind of sort of where the city of Ashland now stands. Shortly thereafter, a trapper by the name of Ewan Young, an old mentor of Kit Carson's, Killed a couple more indigenous in the same area, tribe unknown. Speaking of Carson, he traveled through Modoc and Klamath territory as well in late spring of 1846 while guiding for Captain Fremont. They'd be attacked one evening while camped out on what's now known as Klamath Lake, losing 3 of their party. This spurred the expedition, along with their Delaware scouts, to launch a counterattack the following day. Finding a Klamath fishing village nearby, the trappers commenced their assault, killing 21 supposedly just men. And it didn't stop there. As the group circled the lake, they killed any natives they found in groups of 1s and 2s. News quickly spread among the various bands of the region, and the explorers were constantly either being attacked or under threat of attack as they worked their way south into the Sacramento Valley. And for what it's worth, at least one historian, David Roberts, believes the war party that initially attacked Carson and Fremont, the one what killed 3 of their group, wasn't even a Klamath war party, the tribe that the expedition ultimately exacted revenge upon. In all likelihood, they were Modoc. Almost assuredly, it was the Modoc who pestered them as they traveled south of Klamath Lake. And what's more, that initial attack may not have been as unprovoked as Carson would later claim. Just a month earlier, Fremont and his men had been further south near present-day Redding, California, when they attacked a large indigenous camp on the Sacramento River. The tribe, thought to be the Wintu people, were absolutely slaughtered, and that's a direct quote from a witness. How about another quote from the man himself, Kit Carson, who said it was a perfect butchery. A perfect butchery, indeed. One that saw at least 100, possibly several hundred, natives killed, many of which were attempting to flee. All because of rumors. Fremont had heard from some locals that a large band of 1,000 natives were preparing for an attack on the white settlement, so he and his men simply did a little preemptive killing. Wintu, Klamath, Rogue River. Hopefully I'm beginning to paint a picture here. I know these are all different tribes, but this is all occurring in that northern California, southern Oregon region, all on the outskirts of Modoc land. Hell, while we're at it, I think the Whitman Massacre is worth mentioning as well. Reverend Whitman, who I also briefly mentioned on my last episode, and his wife, along with 11 others, were all killed during an uprising in late November of 1847. Now, this was the Cayuse tribe who did that, and it was several hundred miles away from Modoc territory to the north. Still, though, when it comes to native or white or European relations in the Northwest, things were getting hot. Sparse tribal warfare was quickly being replaced with a steady, seemingly non-stop stream of foreigners invading everybody's territory, and they apparently were not welcome. So as you can see, by the time Captain Jack was learning how to walk and talk, his people were already well accustomed to dealing with the white man, and the white man's ways, at least in the form of fur trappers. But it wasn't until shortly after the aforementioned incident with Fremont that things really ramped up. Partially thanks to Jesse and Lindsay Applegate, the sibling duo who blazed the Applegate Trail, sometimes referred to as the South Road. We're talking the late 1840s at this point, and there's a full-on westward migration underway. Now, back in them days, there was something called the California Trail that branched off the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall in present-day Idaho. This route would take gold seekers southwest through Nevada and straight to Sutter's Mill, where gold was discovered in 1848, near where Sacramento, California now stands. Well, the Applegate Trail, considered by some to be a safer alternative to the Oregon Trail, branched off the California Trail and went straight through the heart of Modoc land, right past Tule Lake and the Lost River before crossing the Cascades and winded north towards the Willamette Valley. As you can imagine, this meant more than a few bloody confrontations between the uninvited migrants and the Modoc people. One in particular that sometimes gets left out of the narrative, probably for a good reason, is said to have occurred in September of 1852 when the Modoc struck a wagon train near Tule Lake, killing over 60 people and taking 2 young girls captive. Maybe. This is one of those that depends on who you ask kind of things. And 60 is the low end when it comes to how many migrants were killed in this particular massacre with no name. Some sources say 65. Another I found claimed 80, and numerous websites, some of them ending with a .gov at the end of their URL, put the number at 90 men, women, and children that the Modoc massacred there on the Applegate Trail in 1852. Or was it 1850? Like I said, it depends on who you ask. I did a bit more digging, and it appears that the location in question is a place known as Bloody Point, just a few miles south of the Oregon border on what's now Highway 139, near the eastern shore of Tule Lake, where the trail passed between an outcropping of lava and the water. Evidently, this was one hell of an ambush spot where the Modoc laid in wait for hapless immigrants in the 1850s. But did they ever kill 60 to 90 men, women, and children in one fell swoop? It's highly doubtful. A much more realistic number that I was able to find comes from an article I'll link to in the show notes, one with actual citations, that makes the much more realistic claim of 36 migrants being killed there at Bloody Point in 1852. And that was for the entire year. Many attacks over many months against many different small wagon trains, resulting in over 36 deaths. Now that is much more believable, at least to me. I just want to make it clear that I don't doubt that the Modoc were killing a lot of white people during the early 1850s. They were absolutely attacking wagon trains and probably any lone travelers that they could find. That is not in dispute. Okay, I'm not trying to make the Modoc out to be a bunch of innocent little angels here. I also want to make it clear that there were a lot of exaggerated claims made during this time, and oftentimes the Modoc soon found themselves getting blamed for things they didn't even do. One such incident involved a band of the Pitt River tribe running off with a large herd of prospector horses, a theft that resulted in several Modoc being killed at the hands of the notorious Benjamin Wright. And boy, oh boy, talk about throwing gasoline on a fire, as if things weren't already bad enough. The Indiana-born and Quaker-raised Wright would soon drift west in 1847 in hopes of striking it rich, just like every other young man bound for California. He soon discovered, however, that his real skill set, and evidently sense of joy, lay in killing natives. He was part of the militia that helped put down the Cayuse Rebellion I briefly mentioned earlier, that resulted in Reverend Whitman's death. But Ben Wright wasn't just killing for the sake of killing. Keep in mind, there was a bounty system in place there in California back in them days. Depending on where you were located, you could get paid $5 for an Indian's severed head or 25 cents per scalp. And to further exasperate matters, the government of California handed out $1.5 million, the equivalent of $58 million in today's money, to fund local militias led by guys just like Ben Wright. And oh, did Ben Wright collect his fair share of bounties. Heads, scalps, fingers, noses, ears. Some he collected as proof just to get paid, while others were grim trophies. He kept him a couple of native women as slaves as well. You can only imagine the hell those gals went through. Not long after he and his men attacked the Modoc in retaliation for the stolen horses and mules, Wright returned to the area, once again attacking a Modoc village. Creeping in close under the cover of darkness, the vigilantes waited until first light to open up on the waking natives, killing over a dozen according to one source. Shortly thereafter, they attacked another village, killing 15 more. The following summer, Ben returned, this time he and his posse intervening during a wagon train attack, thwarting the assault and killing somewhere around 30 warriors in the process. Which begs the question, what came first, whites killing Modoc or Modoc killing whites? I got a feeling that Ben Wright felt justified in killing the Modoc when and where he could find them, based solely on the fact that they were attacking wagon trains. And the Modoc likely felt justified in attacking these trains based on the actions of people like Ben Wright. And on it goes. For the next couple of months, Wright and company occupied themselves by escorting wagon trains through the area, offering up their services as protectors. And you better believe they killed as many Modoc as they could find. One gruesome story has Wright and his men gunning down 2 Modoc women that they saw running for shelter. One was killed outright and the other simply wounded in the arm. Ben dismounted, approached the injured lady, and sank his knife into her. And then came Ben Wright's masterpiece, his magnus opus, the feather in his hat, if you will. The massacre that still bears his name. The killer sent word to the Modoc that he wanted to make peace, even hoisted up a white flag to show his pure intentions. And the Modoc came in, peacefully, honoring that flag of truce. They camped out there with Wright and his men in the rain for several days, looking to negotiate and hopefully come to some sort of an agreement. Hell, there was even a big feast, if you call a whole bunch of food, laced with strychnine, meant to kill as many Modoc as possible, a feast. This plot quickly fell apart, though, as the poison didn't seem to work. Evidently, it had expired or just gone bad, so Ben simply walked up to the head Modoc, pulled out a pair of dragoons from under his poncho, and commenced a firing. Wright's posse, all armed, opened up fire as well. Now, lest you think I'm being biased here, there are some that say neither side's intentions were as pure as the driven snow. One version has it that Wright and his men called the parley in hopes of retrieving a couple of captured women from the Modoc. When they discovered that the natives were planning on double-crossing them, they simply acted first, kicking off the fight and gaining the upper hand. And hell, who knows, maybe both sides showed up looking to kill the other. Maybe that was the plan from the get-go and Ben just happened to act first. Either way, the result saw 0 of Ben Wright's men killed, with the Modoc suffering 30 to 90 fatalities, one of which is rumored to have been Captain Jack's father. And whatever the true start of the fight, even one participant on Wright's side, a William Thompson, admitted to how gruesome it was. As the first shot rang out from Wright's pistol, his men opened a deadly fire with their rifles. For an instant, the savages formed a line and sent a shower of arrows over their heads, but they aimed too high and only 1 or 2 were slightly wounded. Dropping their rifles, Wright's men charged, revolvers in hand. This was too much for savage valor, and what were left fled in terror. It was no longer a battle. The savages were searched out from among the sagebrush and shot like rabbits. Long poles were taken from the wickiups, and those taking refuge in the river were poked out and shot as they struggled in the water. To avoid the bullets, the Indians would dive and swim beneath the water, but watching the bubbles rise as they swam, the men shot them when they came up for air. End quote. And so it went. Over the course of just 25 years, it's estimated that hundreds of Modoc were killed, and that they dispatched nearly an equal number of migrants and settlers. I guess it would be safe to say that both sides could give just as well as they could get. Almost. One thing I'd like to point out here is that it wasn't just the Modoc getting a raw deal there in California. The state did officially have a policy of wholesale extermination when it came to all tribes. We're talking state-sponsored death squads, operate under full support of the law, killing indiscriminately and without repercussion. To quote the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. End of quote. This is the same guy who would also block negotiation treaties if he felt like they were being too generous to the indigenous, by the way. Just to put things into context, the Native American population of California was estimated at about 150,000 people in 1848, right around the time that gold was discovered. A quarter of a century later, when the Modoc War kicked off, you're looking at less than 30,000. And that's for the entire state. A lot of that was disease, yeah. Even the Modoc suffered horribly from smallpox. Still though, even with all the various plagues wreaking havoc on the tribes, they still weren't dying off fast enough as far as many people, even those in office, were concerned. That's where the bounties and the massacres and the rampant killing came into play. What some consider to be a genocide. So hopefully now you're getting some sort of an idea of the environment that Captain Jack was born into. From the late 1820s leading up to his birth and for his entire childhood, his people had been aware of and sometimes the target of awful atrocities. Far out of the scope and range of what they themselves had done or were capable of, even when it came to their most bitter enemies. A very volatile situation predicated by decades of violence and retribution killings that one would only assume would have turned Captain Jack into an American-hating maniac, hell-bent on taking up the torch and continuing to fight his oppressors. And well, if this was the impression you had of Captain Jack and his band of Modoc, you'd be wrong. Especially if you were to ask the citizens of Yreka, California, shortly before the Modoc War began. Jack and his band were frequent visitors of the mining town. Some took up odd jobs there, they shopped in Yreka stores, even attended holiday celebrations with the townsfolk. Hell, during one such celebration, in 1871 on the 4th of July, the town caught on fire and Jack and his Modoc helped put the inferno out. And it was the white miners and citizens of Yreka what gave Jack his captain moniker, on account of an old soldier's brass button jacket that he often wore. In Jack's own words, quote, "I consider myself as a white man," end quote. So what exactly went wrong? How did Captain Jack and his Modoc go from wearing the white man's clothes and shopping in the stores of Yreka to a bloody war with the United States Army in the lava beds of Northern California? Tensions and hostilities between Modoc and migrants continued even after Ben Wright's massacre, until a sort of peace was agreed upon between the tribe and the settlers in the late 1850s. Then, in 1864, the U.S. government stepped in and signed a peace treaty not just with the Modoc, but the Klamath and neighboring Yahuskin band of northern Paiute as well. This treaty saw the formation of the Klamath Reservation in present-day southern Oregon. The tribes would give up all of their land south of the 44 parallel, which included every square inch of Modoc ancestral land, and agree to live together on the aforementioned reservation. This meant the Modoc would be living with their enemies, the Klamath, who just so happened to outnumber them. As you can figure, this caused a whole new set of problems, namely the Klamath buggering, bullying, and abusing their new next-door neighbors. Now, in return for giving up all that land, the Modoc were promised one big lump sum payment, along with future annuities of money and food. These, of course, were slow in coming at first and then just stopped altogether. About a year or so later, the Modoc tired of such living conditions and simply left the reservation, returning south to their own territory. The government was persistent, however. Like an abusive spouse, they claimed that they'd make everything better, that they'd change. Come on, just come on back. We'll protect you from the mean old Klamath. I won't hit you no more. We'll give you food. Come on back. So the Modoc did, and things, of course, did not change. Finally, in 1870, after asking for help from the government over and over and over again, after pleading with officials for better conditions, after being forced to eat their own horses, a band of 50 Modoc men, along with their women and children, left the reservation under the leadership of a young Captain Jack. They returned back to their homeland around Tule Lake and Lost River, oftentimes making the trip west to Wairika, where, like I said, they were generally well received and well behaved. There were still altercations, but none of them seemed to be of the serious sort. There were no wagon trains being attacked, no massacres, nothing like that. All of the problems seemed to stem around trespassing or petty theft, maybe a little bit of intimidation or even irritation. According to one Indian agent, the Modoc were, quote, insolent, and if they wanted flour or beef, they'd find the nearest settler and demand it. Furthermore, sometimes a dozen or so would just walk into a cabin and insist on being fed. And after dining on the free food, they'd sit around the fireplace smoking as if they owned the place. So yeah, I can see how that would be pretty damn irritating. Talk about your neighbor from hell. But this ain't exactly a raid by the Comanche either. For what it's worth, Captain Jack did work with the settlers, even if he was charging them money for using the land. He himself would occasionally find work in the town of Wairika, while other Modoc became ranch hands. They really did seem willing to adapt, even cutting their hair short and wearing white man's clothes. Obviously they weren't all that hated, but still, as good as things might have been in Wairika, there were plenty of other folks there in Northern California that were uncomfortable having the Modoc roaming free and more than a bit covetous of their land. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Modoc weren't against the idea of living on a reservation. They just wanted their own reservation on their own land, somewhere near the Lost River. Also, keep in mind that Jack and his Modoc weren't on the run or hiding during this period. They were just there where they had always been, living their best lives. The Indian agents and the government knew exactly where they were, and there were more than a couple of sit-down talks and parleys with Jack trying to secure their own reservation while the government men tried talking him back up to the Klamath region. Didn't help none, of course, that Jack committed murder around this same time, at least in the eyes of his white neighbors. One of Captain Jack's children became seriously ill, so he turned to a Modoc medicine man to heal the kid. Well, the kid didn't get better and sadly soon passed away, prompting Jack to kill said medicine man. Now, this was culturally acceptable among the Modoc. It was expected. Not so much with the Americans. A murder warrant was issued for Captain Jack, but nothing ever came of it as the reservation issue was first and foremost on everybody's mind. Finally, in 1872, Indian agent Thomas O'Donnell gave orders dispatching the military to use whatever force necessary to get the Modoc back on the reservation. As such, 35 men of the 1st Cavalry, stationed out of Fort Klamath, under the command of a Captain James Jackson, were sent south to deal with the Modoc, picking up about a dozen or so civilians as they headed that way. Civilians who may or may not have had a little bit too much to drink in the town of Linkville the night before. Linkville, of course, is now known as Klamath Falls. Now, orders were clearly given to resolve things peacefully, if at all possible. Indian Agent O'Donnell instructed Captain Jackson in part, quote, "If there is to be any fighting, let the Indians be the aggressors. Fire no gun except in self-defense." End quote. The next morning, November 29th, was bitterly cold as the combined force of 45 or so men approached the Modoc camped on Lost River. There were two camps, actually. One on the west side of the river, just north of Tule Lake, was Jack's village. Directly across on the east side was the camp of Hooker Jim, another Modoc leader who you'll soon hear much more about, along with another feller named Scarface Charlie. Old Scarface sees the soldiers coming and fires off a shot, likely to warn his fellow tribesmen. Captain Jack supposedly was waiting in his lodge as the soldiers approached, thinking that this was going to be another peaceful meeting and that the officers would soon be joining him to talk as they had previously done. Meanwhile, the soldiers quickly enter the village and set up a skirmish line, while at the same time the Modoc warriors are preparing to fight, stripping off their clothes and instructing the women and children to lie down on the ground. I assume to keep them out of the line of fire. The interpreter, a son of one of them Applegate Trailblazing brothers, sees this for what it is and runs out of the camp hollering that the Modoc are about to attack. Captain Jackson of the 1st Cavalry then orders his lieutenant, guy by the name of Frazier Boutelle, to disarm and arrest Scarface Charlie. Only thing is, Scarface ain't having it. He resists as both men go for their guns, firing at the same time. Charlie's rifle blasting a hole through Lieutenant Boutelle's coat sleeve while the officer's pistol grazes the bandana covering Charlie's head. Neither men were injured, but the damage was done and the fight was on. The first shots of the Modoc War had been fired, and a course set in motion that no man could stop. Now, if you'll indulge me just for a moment, I'd like to add a bit more context to the state of affairs directly preceding the Battle of the Lost River. Remember, from April of 1870 to November of 1872, roughly 2.5 years, Captain Jack and his people did maintain an uneasy peace with the local settlers, for the most part. There were no more raids, no more war parties or attacks on wagons or anything like that. Their main crime seems to just be making the locals very nervous. And to be totally honest, one can't really blame the settlers for feeling that way. While the Modoc were at the reservation, the homesteaders began trickling in after being assured that the quote-unquote Indian problems were settled, at least in that area, and that the land was open and theirs for the taking. Then here come the Modocs sashaying back in and demanding rent along with what amounts to protection money. But you can't blame the Modoc either, right? I mean, this was their land, no matter what a piece of broken treaty paper might say. At least back there in their home territory, the Modoc men could provide for their families, and their children were no longer going to sleep with empty bellies or being threatened by the Klamath. And like I said, peace was maintained, but barely. One thing I failed to mention in part 1 was that many of the younger hothead Modoc were indeed looking for any excuse at all to go on the warpath. And the band's shaman or medicine man guy known as Curly-Headed Doctor wasn't helping matters. Old Curly was an early disciple of the ghost dance religion. As such, he helped spread the prophetic promise of the whites soon being driven from their land altogether, of how the Modoc would be reunited with their dead loved ones, and how his medicine would help protect them in battle. He'd get the warriors all worked up, and Kintpuash, or Captain Jack, would have to talk them off the ledge, more than once. Adding to all of this, you may remember me mentioning an Indian agent by the name of T.B. O'Donnell in the last episode. Well, I misspoke. I should have said he was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon, as opposed to simply an agent. That said, O'Donnell was relatively new on the job when all of this occurred, having replaced Alfred Meacham in early 1872. Now, Meacham was trying to work with the Modoc. They knew him, there was a grudging respect. Hell, Meacham was even trying to get their own separate reservation like they wanted. O'Donnell had none of this going for him. He didn't know Captain Jack, he didn't know the intricacies of the relationship with the Modoc, and in turn, they didn't trust him. And when O'Donnell finally took action, contacting the commanding officer at Fort Klamath, Major John Green, and telling him to send his troops down to get Captain Jack, O'Donnell did so without informing Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton or General Canby, the two top military commanders in the area. So, when the army did show up there at the Lost River Camp on November 29, 1872, the situation was tenuous to say the least, even with Captain Jack doing all he could to maintain peace. Now, the original plan was to confront the Modoc with an overwhelming show of force. The hope was that Captain Jack and his people would see the futility in fighting, that they were far outnumbered, and just return to the reservation without putting up a fight. But as we touched on the previous episode, Captain James Jackson of the 1st Cavalry showed up with just a mere 40 troops and a handful of civilians. Not the most intimidating army, numbers-wise, to say the least. Certainly not a large enough force to frighten the Modoc back to the Klamath reservation. The soldiers also failed to catch the natives by surprise, at least not to the full extent that they were hoping to. Captain James Jackson intended to arrive at the village early in the morning when it was still dark in order to catch the Modoc as they were still half asleep, but the weather just would not cooperate. Remember, this is the end of November and the horse soldiers soon found themselves riding through a damn sleet storm. And when that passed, everything was froze over, including them. It was hard riding on a trail that had basically been reduced to a muddy slush, and by the time they did reach the Modoc camp, it was already full light and the troops had been in the saddle freezing their balls off for at least 16 hours. No more element of surprise and certainly not an overwhelming and intimidating show of force. Nevertheless, the soldiers dismounted and headed into Jack's camp, and the civilians did the same, crossing the river and confronting Hooker Jim and his 17 warriors. Important to note, by the way, that these civilians were acting on their own. They were neither ordered to the camp nor was their presence welcome, not by the military or the Modoc. Be that as it may, they still began ordering Hooker Jim and his people to lay down their arms. And at first they did, most of them at least, placing their bows and old flintlocks on the ground. Meanwhile, over at the main camp, there was still no sight of the head man in charge, Captain Jack. Like I said in the previous episode, it's thought, and Jack later claimed, that he was simply waiting in his lodge for the officer in charge, thinking that they'd parlay like before. Now, I have read that the build-up to things turning violent, from the moment the soldiers arrived to the first shot being fired, was somewhere around 45 minutes. If that's true, this does sort of confuse me a bit. Why didn't Jack come out and try to defuse the situation? Was he simply unaware of how tense things were getting outside? Could he not hear what was going on? I don't know. Now, I also mentioned in the last episode how things kicked off when Lieutenant Boutelle tried to disarm and arrest Scarface Charlie, who, by the way, did not gain his nickname from scars earned in battle. Poor guy fell off a wagon when he was a child and got runned over. Not that it matters, I just found it to be an interesting anecdote that reminded me of Johnny Cash. Remember that scar on his face, the way it sort of lent credence to his outlaw persona? Kind of made him look all that much more darker and dangerous. And then you learn that Johnny got that scar back when he had a cyst cut off his face in the Air Force, as opposed to a knife fight in San Quentin. Legend has it that the military doctor was a bit in the cups at the time of the procedure. Anyway, I'm rambling. Point being, Scarface Charlie, while he did have a large scar on his face that made him plenty scary looking, it weren't a combat wound. Not that this made the man any less lethal, mind you, and he damn sure wasn't about to lay down his gun and get arrested. That's where Lieutenant Boutelle comes into play, and the warriors, like Scarface Charlie, who still retained their firearms, were clearly getting ready to use them, and the junior officer quickly realized that violence just wasn't going to be avoided. The sooner you open up the fight, the better, before there are any more preparations, Boutelle remarked, strongly urging Captain Jackson to open up the dance before the warriors got even more of an upper hand. And that's when the lieutenant got the go-ahead to disarm Scarface Charlie. The brief confrontation that ended with both men firing at each other almost simultaneously. And just like that, the war was on. As soon as Lieutenant Boutelle and Scarface Charlie discharged their firearms, the still-armed Modoc warriors began pumping rounds and arrows into the exhausted and half-froze soldiers as those who laid down their guns went for them in a mad scramble. Likewise over at Hooker Jim's camp. As soon as the civilians were momentarily distracted by the opening shots across the river, the warriors moved almost as one, swooping up their discarded rifles and bows and laying down a withering fire, driving the vigilantes out of their village. In their haste to save their own scalps, the retreating civilians succeeded in killing just 2 Modoc, tragically an unarmed woman and her infant child, both cut down by a single shotgun blast. Meantime, over at Jack's camp, it's total chaos. Not only are the troopers attempting to return fire at the Modoc, but they're also trying to control their startled and bucking horses from stampeding. In short order, 8 of their number are wounded, and things likely would have been far worse had Lieutenant Boutelle not rallied his men and led a countercharge, temporarily throwing the Modoc off their game and forcing them to retreat. The whole bloody mess was over in less than 5 minutes. 1 soldier was dead in Captain Jack's village, along with 1 Modoc warrior, a guy they called the Watchman. Over at Hooker Jim's camp, 2 civilians were killed along with the aforementioned woman and her baby, and several on both sides, Modoc and soldiers alike, were wounded. Not exactly a successful military operation, especially considering that had the army indeed shown up with more than 40 men, as originally planned, the Modoc likely would have come in without any problems. But hindsight's 20/20, I reckon. Now, them soldiers did finally re-enter the 2 Modoc camps, burning all of the lodges along with any discarded supplies. Sadly, one of the torched huts contained an elderly Modoc woman who was burned alive. I got to imagine her cruel and painful demise, which in all fairness was not intentional, along with the shotgunning of that mother and her little child, certainly did not help matters as far as any future diplomacy was concerned. Now at this point the Modoc were beaten feet south, some in canoes, headed downriver to Tule Lake and eventually the safety of the lava beds. And how best to describe the lava beds? If you haven't seen them yet, do yourself a favor and do a Google image search. Formed thousands of years ago due to volcanic eruptions, the rugged terrain of the lava beds is just a flat-out fortress. We're talking a labyrinth of natural trenches, along with hundreds of caves and pits that would not only shelter the Modoc but enable them to effectively hold off a much larger force. And what's more, they knew the lava beds like the back of their hand. This was their Alamo, their fallback when things got sketchy, and had been for centuries. And just to give you a better idea, I found a really cool video on YouTube from the Story Out West channel. The host recently did his own excellent series on the Modoc, and in his video titled The Stronghold, the Modoc War Part 2, he actually visits the lava beds and walks through one of these natural trenches. Check it out when you get a chance. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Suffice to say, it's no small wonder that this place would soon be dubbed Jack's Stronghold, or that the Modoc would rush there for protection. Unfortunately, not all of the Modoc immediately retreated to the lava beds. Sadly, there were about a dozen men under the leadership of Hooker Jim that still had their blood up. While the soldiers temporarily retreated to the nearby Crawley Ranch to regroup and lick their wounds, these warriors began making their way east around Tule Lake, stacking bodies. Their first victims were two settlers who, not knowing what was going on and just hearing gunshots, came to investigate. They were immediately cut down, likely before they even knew what hit them. Next up was a family of Australian immigrants, the Bodies. The angry Modocs slaughtered 4 of the Bodie men, thankfully leaving the women unmolested, as they continued on to the nearby Brotherton homestead, killing 3 more. Now, William Brotherton's 12-year-old son was able to escape, running toward the family cabin where his mother, seeing what was happening, ran out to meet him halfway, a Winchester in one hand and a revolver in the other. The brave woman tossed the pistol to her son, and they made a stand of it right there in their home, shooting out of holes in the wall. The Modoc made a few half-hearted runs at the cabin, but the tough lady's courage held them off, so they let her be, moving on to softer targets like Henry Miller. Mr. Miller knew the Modoc well. He was one of their advocates and had promised to warn them if he knew that soldiers were in the area. He almost certainly was not aware of that morning's events, but that didn't stop Hooker Jim from filling old Henry full of lead. The Modoc then came upon a German sheep herder. He tried to make a run for it, but was quickly overtaken and put down. And on it went for the rest of the day. This was everything the settlers had feared ever since the Modoc left the reservation and returned to the area. Their worst nightmare come to fruition. Robert Alexander, John Tober, Christopher Erasmus, just a few of the names of the men who were also killed. Counting the 2 civilians who died in the initial battle there at Hooker Jim's camp, the total number of settlers killed that day is estimated at 14, on the low end, possibly as many as 18. Just to make things clear, this wasn't all the Modoc, just a handful of them. In the same way not all of the settlers there around Tule Lake hated the Modoc, not all of the Modoc were hell-bent on war. Scarface Charlie, for instance. As he made his way to the lava beds, he encountered several of the local homesteaders, warning them that trouble was afoot and to vacate the area. After all, both he and Captain Jack knew that there wasn't going to be no controlling them youngsters once the killing started. Then you had another small group of Modoc, the Hot Creek Band, under the leadership of one Shack Nasty Jim and his brother, Shack Nasty Jake. They were not present at the Battle of Lost River, nor did they want any part of what was happening. As such, a friendly local rancher, John Fairchild, along with a few others, attempted to escort these Hot Creek Modoc up to the relative safety of the clan at the reservation, only getting as far as the town of Linkville before a bunch of drunken vigilantes tried to lynch them. In the same way that Hooker Jim and his warriors didn't care that the civilians they were slaughtering were innocent, these angry citizens of Linkville didn't give 2 shits that these Hot Creek Modoc were non-combatants. After all, they were Indians, and you know the saying about the only good Indians. The justifiably frightened Modoc under the Shack Nasty brothers slipped away, opted instead to join Captain Jack in the safety of the lava beds. 45 Modoc total in that Hot Creek bunch, by the way, 15 of whom were warriors. shoring up Captain Jack's fighting force to around 53 men. And you better believe that many of them were crack shots. Another by the way, if you're wondering how the Shacknasty brothers got their interesting nicknames, well, evidently their mother had poor housekeeping habits. Kept a nasty shack. Other men in that Hot Creek band that will go on to play a part in the coming war had names like Bogus Charlie, who was known to be a bit of a prankster. Steamboat Frank, another guy who got his name from his mother, who was said to have huffed and puffed as she walked. And Ellen's man George, thus named because he had been adopted and later married by an older woman named Ellen. Hell yeah. Now this John Fairchild guy I mentioned, who attempted to bring the Hot Creek band up to the reservation, like I said, he was a friendly face among the Modoc, and had even tried to help them acquire their own reservation along the Lost River. He and some other guys rode out to the lava beds and made contact with the Modoc, trying to make sense of what the hell was going on. And during their brief conversation, Captain Jack basically put all of the blame on Scarface Charlie and Hooker Jim, saying that he himself never wanted any trouble. Now, Fairchild would, in the coming months, actually form a company of civilian volunteers to act as sort of guides for the military, as they were familiar with the lay of the land. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For the rest of November and all that December, other than a few very minor skirmishes, everything was pretty quiet as both the Modoc and the military made preparations. Captain Jack and his Modoc were lucky enough to procure some local cattle, providing them with plenty to eat there in the Stronghold. While at the same time, the Army is also getting its affairs in orders, with Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton now at the helm. Finally, in mid-January 1873, nearly 2 months after the Battle of Lost River, the Army made its move, and this time it weren't with no 40 troops. Numbers vary, but it looks like Lieutenant Colonel Wheaton had about 214 regulars under his command, mixed cavalry and infantry, along with 60 California militiamen, 30 Klamath warriors, around 15 Northern Paiute, and about 25 more California volunteers under John Fairchild. Not only did they have the Modoc vastly outnumbered, but outgunned as well, especially considering how they brought in some artillery in the form of 2 mountain howitzers and some Coehorn mortars. Now I had to look that one up. I don't know why, but it never dawned on me that the military utilized mortars as early as the 1870s. Turns out I was way off, as this particular form of artillery was first invented back in the late 1600s and first used in combat in 1702. And if you're familiar with how mortars work, then you know they'd be perfect for a siege-like standoff, such as the one the Modoc and the U.S. military were now engaged in, if all went as planned and if they were used properly. If. And the plan was pretty straightforward. A couple of cavalry troops would attack the lava beds from the east as the main body of soldiers charged from the west. Both forces would then consolidate south of Jack's stronghold and choke off any warriors attempting to escape as the mortars rained down death from above. Just a simple day's worth of work, according to Lieutenant Frank Wheaton. But that damned old Murphy and his law, always popping up when you don't want him. When the assault finally began on the morning of January 17th, a thick fog had rolled in, leaving visibility limited at best. As such, the artillery and mortars could not be utilized, at least not without risking hitting their own soldiers. And the troops had to approach the stronghold blindly, through the misty haze, not being able to see a damn thing other than the muzzle flashes from the Modoc rifles. The going was slow, to say the least. The soldiers had to cover a lot of open ground over razor-sharp lava rocks, and for the Modoc it was like shooting fish out of a barrel, especially once that fog began to let up. And the Klamath warriors that were supposed to be helping the army? Well, although Wheaton didn't know it at the time, these so-called scouts were playing both sides, handing over much-needed ammunition and supplies to their Modoc brethren on the sly. Now, this wasn't a situation where the Modoc were simply laying behind rocks and firing at their leisure. I don't want to give that impression. Remember, they were outnumbered something like 6 or 7 to 1 and had a huge chunk of rock to defend. According to the late Keith A. Murray, in his book The Modocs and Their War, quote, "It should be emphasized that the Indians had only 50 men to fight over 300, and they had to operate across 3 miles of lava. When the chips were down, they still had to defend a perimeter of over a mile of trenches and outpost positions. The only way they could do this was to shuttle men rapidly back and forth between threatened spots. 2 or 3 riflemen could and did pin down a company of soldiers until more Modoc could suppress an attack on another point and return to fire a few shots at the creeping advance. Every army unit was convinced it had equal or superior numbers of Modocs directly opposite them. And at the end of the battle, many soldiers asserted that there were as many Modocs present as there had been troops. End quote. It also didn't help matters much that the Modoc were openly mocking and laughing at the soldiers and civilians attacking the stronghold, sometimes even calling some of them out by name as they recognized them. Now, this disaster would go down in history as the first battle of the stronghold, and in the previous episode in the intro, I erroneously stated that 35 soldiers lost their lives during this fight. That was incorrect, my bad. According to Robert A. McNally, author of The Modoc War, A Tale of Genocide at the Dawn of America's Gilded Age, it was just 9 soldiers and militiamen that were killed during the battle, with 28 wounded, 3 of them mortally and others so seriously that they would not return to the fight. Still though, that's 9, soon to be 11 men dead from just this one fight. Another soldier and 2 civilians dead from the last time the army met the Modoc on the Lost River. In both cases, the military had the numerical advantage, and in both meetings, they had their asses handed to them. Hell, during the first battle at the Stronghold, not even a single Modoc was killed. And the crazy thing is, the fight almost never even happened. Matter of fact, if it was strictly up to Captain Jack, he would have simply surrendered as soon as the soldiers showed up. The night before the battle, there was a heated debate among the warriors, with Jack and 14 others voting to lay down their arms and avoid any further bloodshed. The majority of the rest, however, nearly 40 Modoc, vetoed this idea and opted to fight. Obviously, Hooker Jim and them others who went on that killing spree wanted to make a stand, knowing that they'd likely be executed if they surrendered. And then you had the shaman, curly-headed doctor. Not only was he guilty of slaughtering civilians as well, but remember, he'd been preaching that ghost dance religion and promising that if the warriors did what he said, they couldn't be touched by the soldiers' bullets. Night before the fight, he ordered hundreds of feet of tule fiber rope painted a bright red and laid around the stronghold, stating that no white man could enter it. The holy man then had a medicine pole erected, upon which he hung a few white-haired dog hides, some hawk feathers, and otter and weasel skins. A fire was then built as the men danced and the women chanted, tossing meat sacrifices into the flames. A powerful medicine that prepared the warriors for the day to come. It was also a big gamble on Curly's part. After all, his power and hold over the Modoc hinged on them defeating the soldiers. So when they did finally come out victorious the following day, this only served to bolster the holy man's prestige and strengthen his position as a leader. The same could not be said for Lieutenant Colonel Wheaton. That first battle of the Stronghold was such an embarrassing defeat that General Edward Canby himself showed up and relieved Wheaton of duty, soon replacing him with the very unpopular Colonel Alvin Gillum. General Canby, by the way, full name Edward Richard Sprigg Canby, had been wearing a uniform for quite some time, serving not only in the Civil War but the Mexican-American War and the Second Seminole War as well. And during the Civil War, it was Canby that led the Union victory at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, forcing all them wild Texas Confederates out of New Mexico. That said, the officer was always considered more of a great administrator as opposed to a fighter, and even then President Ulysses S. Grant didn't consider Canby aggressive enough. Historian John D. Winters described Canby as, quote, very active, but his work makes no great show as yet, because it is conducted too quietly and without ostentation. Canby is a tall man with a thoughtful and kind face, speaks little and to the point, thoroughly a soldier, and his manner is very modest and unassuming and sometimes even embarrassed. End quote. Not sure if that's a bad thing. It sounds to me like this conflict with the Modoc could use a little less ostentation and a lot more thoughtfulness. And it appears that I'm not the only one who thinks so. Rather than quickly attack the Stronghold yet again, a peace commission was formed, chaired by Alfred Meacham, that former superintendent of Indian Affairs, that actually had a somewhat respectful relationship with the Modoc in the past. Only problem was that was in the past. The Modoc now partially blamed Meacham for their treatment at the Klamath Reservation. Then there was Jesse Applegate, another member of the Peace Commission and one of the Applegate brothers who forged the South Trail that still bears their name. Goes without saying that the Modoc couldn't stand the man. It was he and his brother Lindsay who first brought the whites into Modoc territory. And in the years that passed, Applegate had worked to rid the region of Modoc so he could use their land to run his cattle. Sensing this distrust and disdain from the Modoc, General Canby wasn't just content to rely on wishful dreams of peace. He used the intervening days to strengthen his forces, bringing the total number of men under his command to 1,000 and adding a few more mortars in the process. And once again, Captain Jack was looking to surrender. I couldn't help but notice parallels between the Modoc War and the Nez Perce War, particularly with the perceived leaders. If you haven't listened to the episode I did on Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce War, link in the show notes, but spoiler alert. Chief Joseph wasn't really in charge, nor was he ever a war chief. He just happened to be a name that the press picked up on, and seeing as how the Nez Perce War was widely reported, Joseph was somehow cast into the limelight despite his never being in charge of anything other than his small band. Likewise here with Captain Jack. He was the chief, yes, just like Joseph, but he's clearly not in total command of the Modoc. I mean, you had him and his people, but you also had those Hot Creek Modoc and the ones under Hooker Jim, not to mention everybody that was under curly-headed Doctor's spell. And besides, no chief could speak for all of the warriors anyway. Jack couldn't order anyone to either fight or surrender. He could merely suggest and lend his counsel. And just like with the Nez Perce, it was a handful of young hotheads who got the Modoc into this pickle. And it was the hotheads who continued to argue against surrendering, even when facing off against 1,000 troops. Still though, there was an uneasy truce as these peace talks continued for around 3 months, with the Modoc surrounded by the ever-growing force of soldiers. Troops who by now had replaced their Klamath scouts with 70 natives from the Warm Springs Reservation in north-central Washington state. The Modoc demands remained simple. They wanted their own reservation in the Lost River region, or possibly along Hot Creek, and they wanted to be left the hell alone. The government, however, was pushing for an unconditional surrender, and they made it clear that they were going to charge many of the Modoc, especially Hooker Jim and his warriors, for murder. There were several meetings. Sometimes the Modoc would send female emissaries to meet with the Peace Commission. Other times the government would send their own messengers straight into the Stronghold. And while a lot of these sit-downs were peaceful, especially when the trusted John Fairchild was present, many of them were just downright tense. Elijah Steele, a Wairika lawyer who had always gotten along well with the Modoc, barely escaped with his life after spending the night in the Stronghold, refusing to ever return. Finally, the Peace Commission received permission to offer up an alternative solution. Rather than hand the Modoc over to the wrathful Oregonians, they would be sent to Indian Territory for a spell to let things cool down a bit, and then they could negotiate for their own reservation. However, those responsible for slaughtering those innocent civilians had to be held accountable. The Modoc would not agree to this, and they continued to stall. And in a way, you can't fault them. I mean, Ben Wright and his massacre were ever present on their minds. You may recall that from the last episode, how the notorious Indian killer set up a white flag and invited the Modoc in under the ruse of peace talks, only to slaughter dozens of them. It's no small wonder that the Modoc still equated these peace talks with treachery, and it should come as no surprise that they themselves began devising a treacherous plot all of their own. Keep in mind that the army had been slowly moving in closer and closer until they were camped just within sight of the Stronghold, letting the Modoc see just how outnumbered they truly were. And yes, Captain Jack still wanted to surrender. His main opponents, curly-headed Doctor, Hooker Jim, and Sconchin Jim, still all strongly opposed this idea, for the obvious reasons that they knew they'd still be tried and executed. Things got so heated that at one point someone tossed some woman clothing on Captain Jack, deeply shaming the Modoc chief so much that he finally agreed to their treacherous plans. The idea was to kill the peace commissioners, of whom General Canby was now a member. The Modoc figured that if they got rid of these men, the leaders, the rest would just cut their losses and leave, cutting the head off the snake, so to speak. And Captain Jack, in order to regain his strength among the Modoc and assuage his wounded pride, agreed to lead the assassins and kill Canby himself, on the condition that the general would be given one more last chance to meet Modoc demands. On April 5th of 1873, Jack once again met with Alfred Meacham and John Fairchild, along with Judge A.M. Rossborough, who was now also part of the Peace Commission. This several-hour meeting took place in a tent outside of the Stronghold about a mile from Colonel Gillham's camp, and once again, no terms were agreed upon. Thinking that maybe there was room for improvement, Meacham sent word to Captain Jack through a Modoc lady named Toby Riddle that he'd like to speak again in another few days. Now, Toby Riddle's actual real name was Nanukua, or Strange Child, and she was Jack's cousin by blood and married to a Wairika local by the name of Frank Riddle. Originally from Kentucky, Riddle lit out for California when he was just 18 and staked a claim at the Wairika gold diggings. That's how he first met Toby, when her father brought her to town at just 12 years of age in order to sell her services to the white miners. Frank ended up buying Toby outright, and 2 years later, when she was just 14, the couple had a child named Jefferson Davis Riddle, but they wouldn't officially get married until 1869. Needless to say, by the time the Modoc War broke out, both Frank and his wife Toby were often employed by the military as interpreters, with Toby also working as an emissary delivering messages. Upon returning from the Stronghold this last time, however, Miss Riddle had a dire warning for General Canby, claiming she had overheard the Modoc scheming to kill him and the other peace commissioners. The general listened to her respectively, but ultimately dismissed her concerns, allegedly saying, quote, "Toby, I thank you very much for your kind words, but where my duty calls me, I go as a soldier. You see, I have to go." End quote. As such, on Good Friday, April 11th, 1873, General Canby, along with Meacham, Toby, and Frank Riddle, and the newer members of the commission, L.S. Dyer and the Reverend Eleazar Thomas, all convened at the peace tent awaiting the Modoc. And sure enough, Captain Jack showed up. With him was Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, Boston Charlie, Sconchin' John, Ellen's man George, and another guy by the name of Black Jim. All armed, by the way. And once again, despite General Canby breaking out the cigars, the two sides could not come to an agreement. Things grew more and more tense and heated, and suddenly, two Modoc, Slowlux and Bronco, emerged from their hiding spots, rifles in hand. Almost as if on cue, Captain Jack gave the order and pulled out his own revolver, leveling it at an astonished General Canby and pulling the trigger. The pistol misfired, and Jack quickly thumbed back the hammer and squeezed the trigger again, this time sending a round straight into the general's head. This was followed by a second round and a knife to the throat just to make things certain. At the same time, Boston Charlie was busy dispatching the good Reverend Thomas, shooting him in both the chest and head as Sconchin' John pumped 4 rounds into Alfred Meacham. Dyer and Frank Riddle were able to escape on foot as Toby Riddle yelled out to the Modoc that the soldiers were coming, a little white lie that helped her husband and Dyer escape and caused the offending warriors to break camp and head back to the Stronghold. She also saved the life of Alfred Meacham. He was badly wounded but still alive, and in the process of getting scalped when Toby yelled out her warning, causing the Modoc to make a hasty retreat and allowing Toby to tend to Meacham's wounds. Alfred Meacham would live, but the Modoc had just damned themselves, their chance of ever receiving a reservation of their choosing forever dashed with this act of treachery. With no incentive for peace, the military would now attack the Stronghold again, this time with over twice as many soldiers as before. In just a little over a month, the entire war would be over, and in 6 months, Captain Jack would be dead. Easter weekend of 1873 there in Jack's Stronghold was a bit unconventional, to say the least. There were no egg hunts or Easter bonnets, no football or turkey dinners or drunk uncles passed out on the couch. But there was dancing, a whole lot of dancing. General Canby, along with the Reverend Thomas and a still barely alive Meacham, had all been stripped of their clothing before the killers made their hasty getaway. Once back in the safety of the Stronghold, Bogus and Boston Charlie divvied up Thomas's duds as Shack Nasty Jim, John Sconchin, and Hooker Jim laid claim to those of Meacham. As for Jack, he demanded and received General Canby's now blood-stained uniform, grudgingly parting with the officer's pocket watch, which went to Ellen's man George. The general's scalp was then added to curly-headed doctor's medicine pole, and the festivities began, dancing and celebrating that would last for the next 3 nights. And man, I gotta wonder if they really grasped the situation at hand. Did the Modoc not truly understand the might of the U.S. military? I tend to think that they did not. I mean, how could they? We're talking a small tribe of hunter-gatherers, essentially a Stone Age people accustomed to tribal skirmishes with rival bands. They had undergone a rapid change in the past 40, 50 years for sure, but they still had no clear understanding of prolonged military campaigns of the type Europeans or Americans waged. And I don't mean that disparagingly. They just had no way of knowing. I mean, there's a very good chance many of these Modoc believed that the military would now, following the death of Canby, simply cut their losses and go back home. And of course, you had curly-headed Doctor and his big medicine, which was still holding strong in their view. After all, not a single Modoc had yet been killed, nor had any of the soldiers crossed into the Stronghold. So I don't think that these celebrations were the Modoc just blindly ignoring reality. In their worldview, not only were they ahead, but they had a shot at winning the whole damn thing. And hell, let's face it, before the treachery at the peace tent, they did have a bit of wiggle room. Somebody was going to have to pay the price for all those settlers killed back in November. That much was certain. But I do think that had the Modoc surrendered, instead of killing Canby, things would have turned out much differently. At least for Captain Jack, whose fate we'll discuss here in a little bit. Meanwhile, the military response to the killings at the peace tent was excruciatingly slow, mostly due to Colonel Alvin Gillum. Just minutes before Canby and the Reverend were murdered, there was a minor skirmish nearby at Major E.C. Mason's hospital camp, to the east of Jack's Stronghold. A couple of Modocs showed up under a white flag and were granted an audience with a pair of lieutenants. When the officers turned their backs, one of the warriors scooped up a rifle he had hidden in the grass and opened up fire, killing Lieutenant Sherwood. A Captain Adams, manning a nearby signal camp, hears these shots and scribbles down a note for Colonel Gillum, the senior officer under Canby. After all, this was cause for alarm. If the Modoc were brazen enough to launch an attack on the hospital, then there's a damn good chance that the peace commissioners, General Canby included, were in grave danger. Upon receiving this note, Colonel Gillum begins to write one of his own, addressed to the general and warning him of said danger. And literally as Gillum is putting pen to paper, more shots are heard in the distance. This, of course, was the massacre of Canby and Thomas that we discussed at the end of the last episode. Hearing these shots, Gillum quickly springs into action, mobilizing a quick reaction force that he personally leads to come to the aid of the peace commissioners, reportedly running ahead and even snapping off a few shots at Captain Jack as he and the others fled the scene of the crime. Emboldened and with the enemy in sight, Colonel Gillum goes into a full-on sprint, quickly overcoming the warriors and taking down both Jack and Hooker Jim with one single flying roundhouse kick to their heads. And no, that absolutely did not happen. In all actuality, Gillum froze. There was mass confusion there in the army camp, officers and NCOs hollering and mustering up their men, but without any sort of clear directive. Nobody knew what to do and no orders were given. In the colonel's defense, he was allegedly sick with some kind of illness at this time. What type, I'm not sure, but he would actually pass away just a year and a half later, at 45 years old. Like I said, I don't know what type of sickness this was, or if the condition that ultimately killed him was the same that caused him to become immobilized there at a very crucial moment. Nonetheless, he hesitated a little too long. Finally, a Major Biddle steps in. He takes Gillum into a tent and then reemerges without him, taking control and ordering a contingent of troops to the peace tent, their mission to either rescue General Canby and the others, or avenge their deaths. As the soldiers marched at double time towards the sound of gunfire, they're passed by Dyer and Frank Riddle, both of them terrified and running for their lives. Damn, that's gotta be creepy. Just imagine that, being a young private, rushing into the unknown as horrified people are running past you for safety, full speed. I imagine it would have a very puckering effect. Within half an hour, the rescue party finds the bodies of Canby and Thomas, minus their clothing and scalp, and Meacham, still alive but barely. He's also stripped down to his long johns and partially scalped. The Modoc lady / interpreter, Toby Riddle, trying her best to doctor his wounds. A military surgeon attached to the rescue party takes over, forcing some brandy down Meacham's gullet, which was a standard practice in those days to treat shock. Now at this point, to go any further would just be begging for trouble. The soldiers retrieve the dead and Meacham and return to camp, where they would spend the weekend formulating their next move as the Modocs celebrated. This would prove to be a major turning point in the war, at least as far as public opinion was concerned. No longer were the good people of Wairika, California sympathetic with Captain Jack and his band. As General Canby's body was laid in state, effigies were burned in the streets. Peace was no longer an option, there would be no more negotiations, and even President Grant was calling for the literal extermination of the Modoc. And how best to deal with the Modoc, forted up there in the lava beds, was hotly debated. Poison gas was considered, believe it or not, as was strategically placing snipers among the lava rocks just to systematically take the Modoc out at a safe distance. Dogs were suggested. Send in the hounds! And so was body armor. In the end, it was to be a relatively simple affair. No fancy tricks, no elaborate plots, not even any dramatic charges, like in the first battle of the Stronghold. Just a steady, slow advance of soldiers. More meat for the grinder. Troops slowly eking their way across a lava rock hellscape, moving from cover to cover and praying that the next bullet don't find them. And I do mean slowly. The assault began early in the morning on April 15th, just 4 days after Canby's assassination. And seeing what was happening, Captain Jack had sent 8 Modoc warriors outside of the Stronghold as an advance guard. Lying concealed among the rocks, these men were to delay the soldiers as much as possible, a tactic that proved to be successful, as it would take 400 soldiers nearly 6 hours to move just half a mile. Finally, at the cost of 3 soldiers killed and 6 wounded, the troops were 1,000 yards away from the stronghold, nearly within sight of General Canby's scalp flying from that medicine pole. And unlike the first battle of the stronghold, the soldiers would not retreat back come nightfall. Once the sun began to set, orders came down for them to stop where they were and make camp. These poor fighting men had no choice but to spend the sleepless night laying on the jagged rocks, building whatever sort of breastworks they could all around them. The following day, the shelling began, without the artillery doing much initial damage. The Modoc were just too well dug in, and the women and children were now taking shelter in caves, with rocks piled up in front to stop any stray rounds or ricochets. And once again, the soldiers moved slowly. They were being cautious, and I don't blame them. Not a whole lot of ground was taken on the second day, but what the soldiers did take was worth its weight in blood, as they managed to cross curly-headed doctor's medicine rope, the one that was supposed to keep the whites out. This was a big-time morale killer for the Modoc. And almost as if to hammer home that point, that evening they suffered their first casualty. A cannonball landed within the stronghold without exploding. A curious Modoc, at least one source I found claimed that it was a child, but I could not verify that, picked up the cannonball and attempted to remove the detonator with their teeth, and it went off. Another shell made a direct hit into the council fire, sending embers flying everywhere and scaring the shit out of everybody. And while no one was hurt, this would completely shatter what remained of the doctor's medicine. For the first time in a long time, Captain Jack once again retained leadership of the remaining Modoc. They would make a few half-hearted attacks on the soldiers during the dead of night, but they wouldn't risk their numbers by making a full-on assault. They weren't suicidal or stupid, so instead they kind of hung back and concentrated their efforts at taunting the exhausted soldiers, calling out insults, likely questioning the purity of their mothers and sisters. Now, even though the stronghold wasn't wholly surrounded, as was the initial plan, the military had succeeded in cutting off the water supply of the Modoc. Once again, another huge victory. You know, you can arguably go a couple of weeks without food, but a few days without water can be downright deadly. And just one day without would make life miserable, especially for the women and children, the babies. And yes, at least one baby was born in the stronghold during this siege. Later that night, Captain Jack made a decision and began the evacuation, leaving a small rear guard to keep the soldiers distracted. The bulk of the Modoc then escaped from a low depression, leading to a lava flow, now known as Scontian Flow. As this retreat was being undertaken, Ellen's man George led a handful of warriors to Colonel Gillam's camp, which was sparsely guarded, with most of the soldiers gone in the main assault. These Modoc attempted to goad what was left out to fight, but luckily for the troops, they didn't fall for it. The teamster and a couple of reporters wouldn't be so lucky the following day. Around noon, it was their great misfortune to come upon Hooker Jim. The teamster, a 19-year-old named Hoovy, was shot and killed, his body stripped and mutilated as the 2 newspapermen ran for their dear lives. And it wasn't until that next day, around 11 a.m., that the soldiers discovered that Jack's stronghold was now empty, save for one elderly and wounded man and possibly an elderly lady, who were both unceremoniously put out of their misery. The second battle of the stronghold was over. One Modoc, possibly a child, and 1, if not 2, elderly members of the tribe were dead. 7 U.S. servicemen were dead as well, with over a dozen wounded. I think accurate numbers of casualties during this entire war are very hard to come by, so please do keep that in mind. Although the Modoc were now rooted and on the move, they weren't defeated, not yet. There's a strong case to be made that they were now more deadly than ever. At least there in the stronghold, they weren't going anywhere. They were more or less contained. Now on the loose, who knows where the hell they are or what they're going to get up to. How many more hapless souls like that young teamster would be killed? How many homesteaders would wake up with their throats cut? And what's more, they were desperate. Remember, this wasn't just 50 warriors. They had their families. Hell, Captain Jack had a wife, 2 of them, actually, and at least 1 daughter. Most of the other warriors had women and children as well. The main bulk of these Modoc now on the run, at least 100 of them, were non-combatants. And a desperate man fighting for his family's survival will just fight harder. But don't take my word for it. just asked the troops under Captain Evan Thomas of the 12th U.S. Infantry. He and his men, numbering 70 strong, left camp on April 26 to conduct a reconnaissance, just 9 days after the Modoc retreated from the Stronghold. The idea was that the remaining warriors were hunkered down in a lava flow nearby, and Captain Thomas was scouting out a good spot to place some artillery pieces. Blow them out of the rocks. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if Thomas felt like there was strength in numbers, or if he didn't think the Modoc were in his immediate vicinity at that particular time, or what. But he stopped for lunch, he and his men. Called a halt at the worst possible place you can imagine. A small area at the foot of what's now called Sand Butte, a low spot surrounded on 3 sides by bluffs and ridges. The sort of place where, a group of expert guerrilla fighters might just choose to launch a perfect ambush. Sure enough, the Modoc warriors knew precisely where the soldiers were. Hell, they'd been flanking them for miles. And when the troopers called their noonday halt, the Modoc went into position, up on them ridges. Not only were the soldiers 100% exposed and hemmed inside kind of a natural cul-de-sac with only one way out, but they also had no guards posted, and their rifles were stacked up and out of reach, all nice and neat-like. Hell, some of the troops even had their boots off, straight chilling. They had the Modoc outnumbered 2-1, but it didn't matter. Once Scarface Charlie and his 30 opened up fire and began raining down hell on the soldiers, the base of Sand Butte was transformed into a slaughterhouse. Out of the 67 troops that dismounted for lunch, only 42 made it out alive, and damn few of them without getting wounded. And here's the crazy part. It could have been much, much worse. Every man one of them would have likely been rubbed out had Scarface Charlie not shown a little bit of mercy. For some unknown reason, maybe he was running low on ammo, I don't know, but Charlie broke off the attack at about 3 o'clock that afternoon, calling down to the desperate and doomed men, quote, "All you fellers that ain't dead better go on home. We don't want to kill all of you in one day." And true to his word, no more shots were fired. Much like what followed the killing of General Canby, relief was slow in coming. At first, Colonel Gillum sent absolutely nobody, an action that was the final nail in the coffin of this particular assignment and got him relieved of duty. And the rescue party that finally did come got lost that night, leaving the massacre survivors to just lay bleeding on the ground for hours. Once located, the wounded men had to be packed out on stretchers during a driving rain that soon turned to snow. By this point, they're on their second night following the attack. Author Keith Murray wrote, quote, "By dawn, the weary column found itself closer to the old stronghold than to Gillum's camp, so they walked towards that for shelter. The men were bone-weary and covered with a 2 days' growth of whiskers, which were whitened by the snow. Since they had not taken enough warm clothes when they started, they were now thoroughly chilled. Their food and water had been inadequate for a 36-hour expedition, and much of what they had taken out had been given to the wounded. An army went into the lava beds. A motley crew of straggling, disorganized, and exhausted men returned." End quote. It's interesting that he mentions water, as unbeknownst to the army, the Modoc were still struggling to stay hydrated. They were moving from camp to camp, cave to cave, and surviving off ice they chopped from lava tubes, formations that would take months or in some cases years to accumulate, but a very short time to be melted and drank by over 150 thirsty Modoc men, women, and children. They would spend 3 days in Jack's Ice Cave, which I believe you can still visit. Then they hit up the Caldwell Ice Cave, a few miles to the south. Following this, sometime around May 8th, they camped out on a dry lake bed, somewhere south of Scorpion Point, where they dug water out of the ground by hand. This shit is crazy, man. It's like they were all playing a big, deadly game of Naked and Afraid, only with guns. And if you slow down, your kids die. Now, at this point, Colonel Gillum was out, succeeded by General Jefferson Davis, Canby's replacement, who also took charge of the army in the field. And yeah, his name was Jefferson Davis, just not that Jefferson Davis. Not that he was any less of a controversial figure. He shot and killed fellow Union General William Bull Nelson back in 1862 after they got into a heated argument. At one point, Nelvis told Davis to "Go away, you damn puppy," and Davis responded by tossing a crumpled up piece of paper in Nelson's face. This prompted Nelson to slap the ever-loving dog shit out of Davis, who immediately took hold of a revolver and put a round into Bull's chest. Although briefly placed into custody, General Jefferson would never face trial, much less get punished. Matter of fact, he ended up getting promoted to Major General and marched to the sea with Sherman in 1864, a march that led to even more controversy. At one point, Jefferson found he and his troops encumbered with hundreds of slaves, hoping to gain their freedom. Looking to separate himself from this burden, he had his men destroy a bridge after they crossed it, effectively stranding the freedom seekers on the other side. And sure enough, Johnny Reb soon showed up and began slaughtering them. Many of those who tried to find refuge in the water would drown. Jefferson would not be formally punished for this either, but he was banished for a while to Alaska before earning his way back to the mainland, and finally, he got called down to California to deal with these Modoc. Speaking of whom, despite their recent victory, were still being hunted, namely by other Native Americans from the Warm Springs reservation. They had been out scouting and reported that they thought the Modoc were down in the southeastern portion of the lava beds, a theory that proved correct when 3 army supply wagons carrying barrels of whiskey were attacked and seized by the warriors. 3 soldiers were wounded, and the offending Modoc got drunker than Cooter Brown right there on the spot. Army whiskey may not quench your thirst, but I'm willing to bet all was right in their world for a few brief moments. In retaliation, a Captain James C. Hasbrook, commander of B Battery, 4th Artillery, was sent in. He and his men, along with 2 troops of cavalry, set up camp on a nearby dry lake known as Sore Ass Lake. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it reads like sore ass. I also don't know how it got that name, but I think I'm going to err on the side of caution and not drink any water from Sore Ass Lake anytime soon. Anyway, the Army's hunch was correct, and the Modoc were still very close by, some of them doubtless nursing some serious hangovers, and when dawn came, the Modoc launched their attack. Now, full disclosure, I don't know how many men were under Captain Hasbrook, nor do I know how many warriors took part in this attack, only that Captain Jack himself led the raid. 2 soldiers fell dead instantly, with another 3 or 4 wounded. As men began running in panic, 3 more fell, one of which was mortally wounded. Oh boy, here we go. Another repeat of that Thomas Massacre. Captain Jack was even seen on a ridge looking all spooky in the half-light, wearing the dead General Canby's uniform as he orchestrated this would-be slaughter. Fortunately for these soldiers, the NCOs took over. One in particular rallying the troops and bellowing out a, "God damn it, let's charge!" First Sergeant Thomas Kelly led his boys into the thick of it, bringing the fight to the Modoc. And of course his name was Thomas Kelly, right? Nice strong Irish name. And if the movies have taught me anything, it's that you can't have an Old West Army unit without an old grizzled Irish immigrant first sergeant. I like to think that Sergeant Kelly could string together a sequence of profanity that'd make the devil blush, outdrink every soldier in his command, and outfight most men half his age. The kind of guy who could share some folksy Irish wisdom and belt out a beautiful a cappella version of Danny Boy or the Fields of Athenry, and then look you dead in the eye and gut you like a fish. Anyway, sure enough, this countercharge threw the Modoc off their game and caused them to retreat. And although the soldiers lost 5 dead and 8 wounded, they had finally succeeded in beating the Modoc in a stand-up fight. They now knew it could be done at least. No longer was the opposition unbeatable. The opposite was true for the Modoc. As they were trying to get away from the charging soldiers, they ran smack dab into them Warm Springs scouts, leading to even more fierce fighting. By the way, last episode, I stupidly said that these scouts were from the Warm Springs Reservation in central Washington state. I meant to say Oregon, about 60-70 miles north of present-day Bend, Oregon. So this whole battle was an awful defeat from the Modoc for a few different reasons. They'd come out on top in nearly every fight, and with each new victory, they were able to resupply themselves with ammo from the dead or retreating soldiers, not to mention other supplies. Not only was that denied them here at the Battle of Dry Lake, but they also lost 24 horses in their rush to get away. 24 steeds that they couldn't really afford to lose. But worse than all of that was the death of Ellen's man George. Considered by some to be one of the chief strategists of the Modoc, George was fatally wounded and would die later that day, hastening the end of the war more than any other single event. Keep in mind that George was one of them Hot Creek Modoc, and evidently he and Captain Jack never really saw eye to eye. Think back to the very beginning, before this war even started. How some Modoc, even in Jack's band, wanted to go on the warpath, and how he was barely able to restrain them. And then throughout those months of peace talks, how certain factions within the Stronghold opposed surrender. How they mocked and threatened Captain Jack. All the discord and jealousy as various warriors vied for control, one of the most vocal at the time being curly-headed Doctor. And Ellen's man George backed the shaman 100%. With George's death, all of this animosity finally came to a head. Many of the warriors, the Hot Creek outfit along with Hooker Jim, blamed Jack, accusing him of purposely ordering Ellen's man into the thickest of the fighting, hoping he'd get killed. As such, some of those pushing the hardest for war would now abandon Jack. Steamboat Frank, Bogus Charlie, Shack Nasty Jim, and of course that scoundrel Hooker Jim. They, along with about 10 of the Hot Creek Modoc, took their families and simply left, moving quickly and silently until they were about 40 miles away, completely out of the war zone, where they then just kind of hunkered down, at least temporarily. Now I know that I have the benefit of looking back at all this, from the comfort of my air-conditioned home, with my clean clothes and clean drinking water and a fridge full of food, with my 21st century mindset. I'm also aware that we'll never know the full story when it comes to all of these events. But still, I gotta say, I'm not much of a fan of this Hooker Jim guy. Seems like going to war was all fine and good when they were winning, but now that it's getting down to the nut cutting, he's essentially just taking his ball and going home. Meanwhile, Jack and the remaining Modoc, the fighting force now of just an estimated 30 men, were on the move, eventually setting up camp on Big Sand Butte, where the army found them. This was about 10 days after their defeat there at Sorass Lake. Still, though, both sides were hesitant to kick off the fight. Jack, of course, was lacking both manpower and ammunition. Adding to his troubles, where he and his people were camped on the top of that butte, there was neither food nor water. Like the poet once said, he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. I'm not sure if Captain Jack was familiar with Oliver Goldsmith, but he certainly knew the sentiment. As the military worked to surround him, the Modocs slipped away once again, and once again, the chase was on. A few days later, Hasbrook and his men strike a fresh trail and are fired upon. Thinking that this was Jack's Modoc, he orders pursuit, quickly capturing 10 women and children. Turns out this was part of Hooker Jim's band. He had gotten nosy and come down from his hidey hole to see what was going on, and he got. The women were brought in for interrogations, and then a couple of them were sent back to Jim to tell him to come on in and surrender. Like before, this was to be an unconditional surrender, but the army made it clear that they would treat him and his warriors as prisoners of war. In other words, Jim wouldn't be immediately executed. Hooker sent word back that he'd only surrender if John Fairchild were present to protect him. This was done. Fairchild arrived, and the warriors all surrendered. All of them except for that dang old Hooker Jim. Per Keith A. Murray in the Modocs and Their War, quote, "The Modocs were destitute. Their horses were sorry-looking nags, skinny and lame. The men were wearing portions of United States Army uniforms taken from the bodies of the dead in the months before. The women were still wearing clothing taken from the homes of settlers the previous November, and these clothes were badly faded and worn, with crude patches holding them together. Both the men and women had daubed their faces with pitch as a sign of mourning for their defeat." End quote. Shack Nasty Jim, Steamboat Frank, and Curly-Headed Doctor were among them surrendering. But like I said, not Hooker Jim, at least not at first. Soon enough, though, he came running into camp, barreling his way into General Jefferson's tent, prostrating himself before the officer. It turns out that the brave Hooker Jim was hiding nearby, watching his fellow Modocs surrender. Once he realized that nobody was being massacred, he finally came in, running at full speed past the soldiers, and throwing himself at the mercy of Jefferson. General Davis, not General Jefferson. I don't know why I keep calling him General Jefferson. Jefferson was his first name. His pleas and supplications were effective. So ready to end the hostilities was General Davis that he awarded amnesty for Hooker Jim, along with Bogus Charlie, Steamboat Frank, and Shack Nasty Jim. They'd be pardoned for the murder of the settlers way back when and not be held accountable for the deaths of Canby and Thomas. All they had to do was help him capture Captain Jack, a bargain that these Modoc jumped at. We're at the end of May 1873 now. Captain Jack is still free with 30-some-odd warriors and their families. Maybe. The numbers differ depending on what source you read. Was it 32 warriors or 37? It's also important to note that they weren't all bunched up together in one group all of the time. Often they were hiding out separately in small family groups. Nevertheless, Hooker Jim and them other three had a pretty good idea where to look. The army sent them out, and in no time flat, they show up at Jack's newest camp, where, surprise, surprise, they are not welcomed with open arms. Captain Jack is openly hostile, especially when these 4 former allies admit that they're now working with the military and that they're there to convince him to surrender. Were these not the same belligerents who wouldn't let him lay down his arms months earlier? The same bloodthirsty fools who draped him in women's clothing and even threatened him with death if he surrendered there at the Stronghold? Jack strongly rebuked Hooker Jim and the others, saying that he'd now never surrender, and if he was to die, he'd do so with a rifle in his hand, as opposed to a noose around his neck. In spite of all this, there was dissent among his ranks. Scarface Charlie listened intently and spent time talking with the 4 spies. He and Jack had always been friends, but the still defiant Modoc were tired, including Charlie. He was tired of running, always being half-assed starved, tired of seeing his women and children going to bed with empty bellies, tired of fighting. When Hooker Jim returned to his new handlers, he reported that there were only 24 warriors with Jack, and that many of them now had wavering loyalty to their leader. With this new intel, the army decided to strike while the iron was hot. They moved forward, advancing on the camp until they were quickly met by Boston Charlie, who is more than ready to surrender at this point. He even asked the soldiers why they brought so many people, before laying down his rifle and shaking hands all around. Others would then start trickling in, some willfully and some being rounded up in groups of 1s and 2s. But not Jack. He's still up there and he's still armed. Finally, a Dr. Cabanis was brought in to speak with him, at a distance, of course. Cabanis was a military surgeon, I believe the same one who treated Meacham after he was wounded. He was with General Canby and Gillum during some of the peace talks, and he and Jack had previously met. At present, the Modoc leader wanted to know what would happen if he surrendered. Cabanis said that he wasn't authorized to say. Jack then complained that he and his people had no food or clothing, which the doctor immediately sent for. He and another Modoc delivered and distributed them among Captain Jack's people, and Cabanis even spent the night there in camp. But when he awoke, Jack was gone, using the excuse that he was looking for a better camp, when in fact, he couldn't bear watching his fellow warriors surrender. The end was inevitable at this point, though. A detachment of troops was hot on Jack's trail, and they found him on Willow Creek on the 4th of June, 1873. Or at least they found his half-brother, Humpy Joe, thus named due to having a hunchback. Humpy was told that they were surrounded and to go fetch Jack. He leaves to do so, and then nothing. Finally, just as the army is thinking they got to go in there and get Jack out, he emerges, looking exhausted yet still armed, asking for John Fairchild. The officer in charge, Major Trimble, told him that Fairchild was not present, and Jack simply handed over his rifle, stating that his legs gave out. With Jack and Humpy were 2 other Modoc warriors along with their women and children, and the war was officially over. Interesting to note that although the numbers and the names varied, not all of the Modocs surrendered, nor were they all rounded up. A few did manage to slip through the cracks, but since they weren't leaders or anything like that, they were not pursued. One of these was Miller's Charlie, the one who shot Lieutenant Sherwood in the back right before General Canby was murdered. Not only would Charlie never face trial, but he would live another 38 years. All the other main culprits were now in military custody, though. Captain Jack, the Shack Nasty brothers, curly-headed Doctor, Boston Charlie, Scarface Charlie, Steamboat, Hooker Jim, everybody. Prisoners of war. All that was left now was the doling out of justice, or at least what amounted to justice. Jack was shackled and, along with the other Modoc, transferred up to Fort Klamath, as state and federal authorities began arguing over what to do with him. In the end, it was agreed that only 6 Modoc would be tried for war crimes. Captain Jack, of course, along with Boston Charlie, John Sconchin, Slow Lux, Barncho, and Black Jim. Now, I know a lot of these names can be confusing as to who did what, so here's just a little refresher. Boston Charlie, roughly 19-20 years old, was part of Hooker Jim's war party that killed those settlers around Tule Lake. He was also present when General Canby was murdered and personally helped kill Reverend Thomas. Sconchin John was quite a bit older. I'd say, just by judging his photo, at a minimum he was in his 40s, probably in his 50s. But he was also present at the murder at the peace tent, and it was he who fired all those rounds into Meacham. Then you got Slow Lux and Barncho, or Brancho, depending on the source. These 2 guys were pretty young, but they're the ones who were hiding and jumped up with rifles in their hands at the onslaught of Canby's murder. Captain Jack, you already know, and finally, we've got Black Jim. I don't think I've mentioned Black Jim before. He's kind of slipped through the cracks somehow in this entire series, but he was one of Captain Jack's people. He was there at the fight at Lost River, and he was there when Canby was killed. I don't know why I failed to mention his name on the last episode. Just to kind of sort of get a better idea of these men and their standing among the tribe. At one point during the trial, the accused were described in terms of military rank. Obviously, Jack was in charge, but Sconchin was equated to a sergeant. Black Jim, a quote-unquote watchman, not sure what that means. Boston, just a high private. And Slowlux and Barnshow were described as, quote, not anything, end quote. As for the trial itself, it was a bit of a farce. It was a foregone conclusion that the men would hang, they just had to get this formality out of the way. You don't just kill a general and get away with it, right? The accused would arrive at Fort Klamath on July 4th, 1873, and 4 days later, on the 8th, all 6 were found guilty and sentenced to hang. And no matter what your opinion may be as to whether or not these Modoc deserved their fate, there's no denying that if this trial occurred today, it would be extremely illegal. The jury was made up of military officials, some of which had fought against Jack and the others. Undoubtedly, they knew some of the fallen soldiers. The Modoc were given no legal counsel, and half of them, including Jack, couldn't even speak English. Their translators, Frank Riddle and his wife Toby, would also testify on behalf of the government. That said, there were calls for leniency, even from the War Department, believe it or not, who asked that the death sentences of Barnshow and Slowlux be commuted. I guess the argument here was that they were just common foot soldiers whose worst crime was knocking down Toby Riddle during the killing of Canby and the Reverend. It was noted that neither one of these young men took any particular interest in the trial, and that they likely had no real idea of what was occurring. This clemency was granted. Both men would be spared from execution, but would still do hard time on the rock, Alcatraz. Now, during the trial, Captain Jack was permitted to speak, and he did speak his mind, placing all the blame on others, especially Hooker Jim. Quote, I never told Hooker Jim and his party to murder any of them settlers. End quote. He would also go on to implicate Jim and the others as the masterminds behind Canby's death. In short, Jack was saying that none of this was his fault, and I think he was justifiably very frustrated at the irony of the whole process. He had wanted to surrender. He had not taken part in the killing of any of those settlers. Time and time again, it was Hooker Jim who was one of the loudest supporters of violence. And yet he went free as Jack sat there arguing for his life in a room full of white men. All for naught. The execution was set for October 3rd, 1873. And the condemned watched from their cells as a scaffold was built, watched the soldiers dig 6 graves. And they dug 6 graves because none of them knew that Slowlux and Barnco had been given leniency, including Slowlux and Barncho. Still, though, kind of messed up to watch your own grave being dug. I can only imagine that would work a number on your brain. On the day of the execution, the Modoc listened politely as a priest came to visit. They were then all given a final chance to speak, with Jack once again placing the blame on the others, particularly Bogus, Shacknasty Jim, Hooker Jim, and Steamboat Frank. Next up, Slowlux and Barnshow spoke, both saying that they were 100% innocent, which was not entirely the truth, but I get it. Black Jim then used this opportunity to ask for a pardon, saying that he'd be a good chief of the Modoc if only the whites would let him go. And then Boston Charlie chimed in, allegedly saying, quote, when I look on both sides of me, I think of these other men as women. I do not fear death. I think I am the only man in the room. I fought in the front ranks with Shacknasty, Steamboat, Bogus, and Hooker. I am altogether a man and not half a woman. End quote. When asked why he helped kill Canby, Boston explained that it was because the Modoc constantly feared treachery and that they figured that if they killed the leaders, the rest of the whites would leave. And he did back up Jack's claims by admitting it was the youngsters who forced the issue and prevented Captain Jack from stopping the murders. As for Sconchin John, he blamed the whole bloody war on the superintendent of Indian Affairs, O'Donnell. Remember him? And he finished by saying that he, Sconchin, was old and just to let him die. It was finally announced that Slowlux and Barnshow would not be executed, that they'd instead spend the rest of their lives at Alcatraz. With this, Jack, Black Jim, Sconchin, and Boston were led to the gallows. Another prayer and then the axe fell. cutting the ropes and plunging all four to their deaths. Captain Jack and Black Jim appeared to die instantly, while Sconchin and Boston both kicked for a few moments. By 10:28 a.m., the men were pronounced dead, cut down, and placed in coffins. No word on what Hooker Jim was up to at this time. That might be the most frustrating part of this whole story. Once again, I know maybe we don't have all the details, but just judging by the available information, it seems to me like he was mostly to blame for the whole dang war, at least insofar as the Modoc were to be blamed. Plenty of blame to be found on all sides, really. But Hooker Jim led the party that went murdering directly after the Battle of Lost River. He opposed surrendering in the Stronghold. He helped to pressure Jack into murdering Canby. And yet he goes free while Jack is executed. By the way, I'm not saying that I think Jack is innocent. He was a grown man and nobody forced him to pull that trigger. He's 110% responsible for killing General Canby. I just don't think things would have escalated to that point had it not been for old Hooker Jim. Never did find out why he went by Hooker Jim, by the way. As for the rest of the Modocs, some were permitted to return to the Yannex reservation. I'm probably flubbing that pronunciation, which was a sub-agency of the Klamath Reservation, where their fellow tribesmen who hadn't taken part in the war were living. The others, considered to be the most belligerent, were exiled to Indian Territory. Them and their families, all total it was 39 men, 54 women, and 60 children, who were placed on the Quapaw Agency in what's now the northeast corner of Oklahoma. Ugh, gross. And Scarface Charlie was now their leader, at just 22 years of age, by the way. 22. Bet you didn't know that. I didn't either until very recently. But just Google some of the people I've been talking about. It's astonishing how young some of them look. Hooker Jim, in particular, appears to still be in his teens, although I think he was probably like 23 or so by the end of the war. Captain Jack was only 35 at the time of his death, and judging by a picture of the holy man curly-headed doctor, he was about the same age. The only one of them that looks like they're a little bit older was Sconch and John. No telling how young Slowlux and Barncho were, but I highly doubt they were older than 16, 17. Around 50 extremely young men defied the U.S. Army for nearly a year, outwitting and outfighting them on more than one occasion, killing a general in the process. The only general, by the way, that was ever killed during the so-called Indian Wars. Check me on that, but I believe it is the truth. The Modoc killed dozens of soldiers and volunteers during this war, and cost the U.S. government $420,000, the equivalent of $10 million in today's money. And don't worry, I used an inflation calculator on that one, not my own very limited math skills. Now, it's hard to determine just what became of many of these people we spoke of here in this series. Hooker Jim would not live long. He died just a few years after being sent to Oklahoma, cause unknown, at least to me. Not sure what happened to Barncho or Bronco or whatever his name, but Slowlux was pardoned after just 5 years at Alcatraz. He changed his name to George Denny and lived until 1899. Curly-headed Doctor died in 1890, and Steamboat Frank became a minister. Scarface Charlie, as it turns out, was a gifted craftsman. Spent his time designing and selling furniture, as well as a typeface that was used for the phonetic transcription of the Modoc language. Remember Miss Toby Riddle, the Modoc wife of Jack Riddle and the savior of Alfred Meacham? Well, she lived all the way to 1932, well into her 70s. Meacham would actually try to capitalize on his experience in the Modoc War and went on tour across the country, bringing Toby with him. He dubbed her the woman chief of the Modoc and gave her the fake name of Wynema and helped her to become semi-famous. A well-respected lady, Wynema would be granted a monthly pension of $25 for the rest of her life, largely due to Alfred Meacham's help. And while some do think Meacham was exploiting the Modoc to line his own pockets during these speaking tours, and while he did stretch the truth and embellish, he also, whatever his motives, did do a lot of good work on behalf of Native Americans. He even brought Chief Joseph to Washington, D.C. in 1879 to speak with Congress on behalf of the Nez Perce. By the year 1900, any Modoc who wished to return to the Klamath Reservation were allowed to do so, and many of them did. However, not all of them, and their descendants still live in Oklahoma today. Matter of fact, the headquarters for the entire Modoc Nation is in Miami, Oklahoma, And out of the 250 registered tribal members, 120 of them reside in Texas's neighbor to the north. Finally, I would like to recommend once again the book, The Modocs and Their War, by Keith A. Murray. There was so much that occurred during this conflict that I just could not fit it all into this series. So do yourself a favor and pick up this book if you get a chance. There's a lot of interesting details that I wasn't able to cover. But I will leave you with Mr. Murray's parting words, the last few paragraphs of his book. Just keep in mind that this was all written in the 1950s, but I think it bears repeating. Quote, "Today, the land of burned out fires is much as it always was. The lake has been drastically reduced in size, and the ancient bed is covered with grain fields, crisscrossed by highways and railroads. Yet on a foggy morning, these fade away, and the gray mist gives the appearance of water, with all the ancient islands and landmarks clearly visible. The United States government has taken over most of the battle area as the Lava Bed's National Monument. Trails take the visitor past the rocky fortifications in the Stronghold, through the Thomas Wright Field, and by the Gillum encampment. With only a few exceptions, these areas look almost as they did 80 years ago. In other, more inaccessible areas, the student of the war needs to be a rugged hiker in order to follow the routes of the Indians and their American antagonists. Outside the monument area and the lake basin, some of the old ranches are still farmed. Cattle and hay are still grown on the Fairchild Ranch, although the place has passed through several hands since it was first claimed and settled. Traces of the old immigrant roads may still be seen if one knows where to look. Most of the land in the monument that the whites wanted so badly is now remarkable only for its extreme desolation and solitude. In summer, a few head of deer and antelope graze through the lava fields. Rodents swarm through the rocks, while their enemies, the hawks and the owls, glide silently overhead." End quote. And that's about all I've got on Captain Jack and the Modoc War. Thanks for sticking with it. Hope you learned something new. I know I did. Before researching this, I only had a passing familiarity with Captain Jack, and this really helped me flesh it all out in my head. Thanks for all the support. Thanks for listening. And thank you for continuing to share the Wild West extravaganza. You make it all worth it.